we turn our gaze to all things pertaining to families. Yes, it's the Family Hub. It's a space where we discuss all things impacting family. Now, today we're very, very excited to introduce you to the Muslim Family Law Hub. Now, they are a non-profit organization that aims to advocate for more equitable Muslim law outcomes in South Africa. Now, this is after many months of hard work, focusing particularly on marriage, divorce, and inheritance, and I suppose relaying this in a more accessible and user-friendly format. They recognize the fact that Muslim minorities find themselves at the intersection of two legal systems, that is state law and Islamic law. Now, this unique position presents distinct challenges that I know many of you have experienced at some point in your life, or maybe watched significant others experience this. And of course, this is particularly pertaining to matters of family law, and we know that this is an area that touches all of us at some point. Muslims must navigate these complexities of adhering to their faith-based to their faith-based principles, while also complying with the country's state legislative framework. Their platform aims to educate and empower individuals with the necessary and ultimately an understanding that fosters the best outcomes for everyone in their community. With that mouthful, please to join me in welcoming, because she's going to unpack all of what I said now for us in studio with us, advocate of the High Court of South Africa and one of the directors on the board of the Muslim Family Law Hub, Fatima Essop. Assalamu alaikum. Shukran for joining us and welcome, Fatima.
Wa alaikum salam, Khadija, and thank you for having me on air today.
Now, you know what? Now, I had the privilege of attending what you could refer to as the soft launch of the Muslim Family Law Hub. That was a couple of weeks ago, and I think many of us stepped away from that pretty excited about it. Listening to yourself as one of the directors speaking about it, months and I'm sure years of hard work that went into putting that together. And as I said, you know, it's family law has touched every single one of us at some point or the other. Now, being a group of professional women, I'm sure you have sufficient to keep you busy, but there was something that drove you and motivated you to start this non-profit organization. Speak to us a little bit about that.
Okay, thanks, Khadija. So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I've been involved in the Muslim family law sphere for many years. It started many years ago when I did my articles at a non-profit called the Legal Resources Center. And there we had one of the first cases where a woman was going through a divorce, and she tried to she brought an application to the court to get some kind of relief after her husband talaqed her without any good reason. It was a case of violence versus Idras, and that was the first case where I was exposed to Muslim family law in the South African law context. Subsequent to the Legal Resources Center, I worked at the Women's Legal Center, and there too we got so many women coming in by the door. At that stage, Muslim marriages weren't recognized as valid in South African law, and so many women suffered because of that. And one of our first cases that we took on there was the Daniels case, where a woman whose husband died without a will, and normally in South Africa, if your husband dies or your wife dies without a will, then the South African interstate laws kick in. And that basically stipulates that a spouse is entitled to inherit a certain portion of your estate. But because at that stage, Mrs. Daniels was married by Muslim law only, they would not allow her to inherit as a spouse, and so the matter was taken all the way to the Constitutional Court, where the court then held that Mrs. Daniels would be regarded, it was unfair not to include her as a spouse, even though she was married by Muslim rights, and the court then instructed the lawmaker to change the law to include spouses who were married by Muslim law in the Interstate Succession Act. So that was my initial exposure to it, and over the years, as a legal professional, I've always had women come to me for advice because they're going through a difficult divorce. Their husbands are refusing to give their talaq. They may be struggling to get a fasakh. Maybe they've been left disadvantaged because they haven't been given sufficient security of tenure on the death of their husband. They don't necessarily have a place to stay, etc. And that has always then been something I've always felt very concerned about, is that because our Muslim marriages were not recognized, our women and children were left vulnerable in South African law. Now, of course, 20 odd years later, although we don't have any law, we don't have legislation specifically recognizing Muslim marriages and their consequences, or Islamic divorces and their consequences, at least we have the court saying, in 2022, I think, the Women's Legal Centre basically took a case all the way to the Constitutional Court, where the court then said this is unfair and unlawful, that Muslim marriages are actually, for all intents and purposes, valid and lawful. But that still doesn't mean that women are necessarily completely protected, right? And so because of all of women are constantly, for instance, the state has no record, for instance, of our marriages, right? And if you married by Muslim rights, you historically couldn't go to a South African court if you wanted a divorce. You had to go through, either you had to wait for your husband to give you a talaq. Many times your husbands refuse to give a talaq, even if they are at fault, or you have to go through a process of fasakh application. And that comes with its own challenges for many women. And so despite the fact that the courts have tried to come to the aid of women were still struggling, especially in the context of marriage and divorce in Islamic law. And so at some stage I realized that, so then I think it was about 12 years ago, I decided to do a degree. My background is in South African law, but I wanted to learn more about my Islamic law tradition. And so I did the BA in Islamic Studies and Arabic at IPSA, the International Peace College of South Africa. I think that was in 2013. I registered for that degree. And it was a very enriching experience, because it was quite amazing to learn the rich Islamic law tradition. And sometimes you hear from different sources that Islamic law, it's immutable, it's fixed, it's the Quran and the Sunnah, and there's no man, no woman or man can give their kind of a take on it. But actually it's nothing like that. What I learned in, for instance, usul fiqh, or principles of Islamic jurisprudence, is that there are various differences of opinion in Islamic law. And in fact, that is celebrated, that differences of opinion. And I think I mentioned it at the launch, the ikhtilaf al-fuqaha, the differences of opinion between the scholars, because it's a blessing. And so you have different schools of thought, and even within the schools of thought, you have differences of opinion. And that was very refreshing for me to learn that actually Islamic law is very easy, flexible, and allows for differences of opinion depending on the circumstances. And that in fact it's it's the Quran and the Sunnah, but that also is open to ijtihad and interpretation, that there's consensus, there's qiyas, analogy, but there's also stuff like public interest, what's in the public interest. And there's also stuff like urf, custom, what is the custom of the place where you're living in. And there are also legal maxims, for instance, do no harm. So these are all principles. And then of course there's maqasid al-sharia. What are the objectives of the law that one has to consider when implementing a particular substantive ruling? So that for me was a wonderful experience. And then after my degree at IPSA, I decided to do a PhD, where I looked at the intersection between South African law of inheritance and the Islamic law of inheritance. And what was very different for me about my PhD was I decided to do empirical research. So in law, normally you sit with books and you learn the rules and the theory and the doctrine, but you don't often go into the community to see how that law finds application. So the law might say one thing, but when you go into the community, you find the lived reality can be completely different. And so during my time, I was also lecturing at UCT at the time. I then started doing empirical research. I did empirical research on Islamic divorces, where I sat in on the Sharia court at one of the ulama bodies, and I interviewed some women who were going through fasakhs. And then I also did empirical research on inheritance within the Cape Town community, and interviewed different lawyers, looked through lots of different Islamic wills, tried to identify what are the kind of issues that people struggle with when trying to implement Islamic inheritance law in South Africa. And it was very interesting, some of the challenges that one uncovers, right? Because, say, for instance, the Islamic law says that a son is entitled to double the share of the daughter. And the understanding there is, of course, that he has more responsibility. So if he gets double, the understanding is that if the father's passed away, that he's going to look after his mother. But the reality on the ground is that that's not always the case, right? He's now gotten married, and the daughter and the mother's only entitled to 1/8 share in the house, according to Islamic law. So she has a small share in that house, despite living in that house maybe for 30 years. He now has the biggest share. And suddenly his wife says, but we need that house. Why can't we sell it? Because we need a deposit for our own house. That house is old. We're not really in it. And surely your mommy can find somewhere. She doesn't have to stay in that house, right? Because she only has an 1/8 share in the house, she can potentially be has a lesser say, and the son would then potentially sell the house without giving her any form of security of tenure at that point. Security of tenure basically meaning she then doesn't have a set place to live.
Yeah.
So those are, and it was quite interesting because in a lot of the Islamic worlds, you will find that husbands were trying to protect their wives through different measures. So, for instance, they would try and introduce what they call a usufruct, where they'll say the house is because inevitably the house is generally in the husband's name.
Yeah.
And the house is generally like the main property in the asset in the estate. And then he'll try and say, well, I'll create a usufruct for my wife so that she can use and enjoy the house during her lifetime, and on her death, the house can be distributed to my Islamic law heirs. Now, some scholars in the Cape Town will argue that that is not compliant with Sharia, that if you want to make provision, you should do it before you pass away. And that comes with its own challenges. But in any event, I'm digressing. I'm just going to some of the detail that led me to the point where I realized that there was a need to kind of deal with all, to kind of educate the community, really. And after I graduated with my PhD, I was very lucky, alhamdulillah, to get a fellowship to attend Harvard Law School, where I was a fellow in the program in law and society in the Muslim world. And there I was doing research and encountered other colleagues from around the world who also dealt with Muslim family law in their jurisdictions. And it was there that I had this idea that maybe what we need is a platform where the community can access information in an easily understandable way on both Islamic law and South African law. In each of the three, so those are the three main areas, is the law of marriage, the law of divorce, and the law of inheritance. It's basically the whole life cycle from marriage, from when you get married, and then of course there are some people where it doesn't work out, but the law makes provision for that. How does one navigate divorce? And then of course there's inheritance. How does one go about making sure that you protect your family on your death, but that it's also consistent and compliant with South African law. And this is, I mean, we were chatting before about this notion of, so academics write on these. Yeah. They write on this, there's enough material out there. But the problem is that the lay people don't go and read academic journals. So when we write and we publish, so I did ethnographical research on Islamic divorce and I published it, but I'm sure there are not many people, lay people in the community who will go and take the time to go and read that publication. Or if I write on Islamic inheritance or anybody else for that matter in academia, it tends to just circulate within academia. And what I felt was important was that it's about democratizing knowledge and making it accessible to lay people. And that was the idea then. That's where I had the idea in when I was at Harvard. And when I got back last year, I thought I need to find. And then, of course, when I chatted to the director, she said, why don't you create an NPO to house this website? But then in addition to the website, you can have other programs, other educational programs as well. Because initially it was just going to be this, in my mind, this website. And then she gave me the idea about founding an NPO. And that's where the idea of the hub came in. And then that's when I got back last year. That's when I decided to, let's just do this. Let's found the hub. And I approached various women who are the current board members about coming on board to help me with this initiative. And they, alhamdulillah, they all agreed. They're all three very dynamic women in their own right. And they were all quite keen to help. And I don't know if you want to hear a bit more about them, because I think they're quite amazing.
No, I think it's important that we do hear about them, because I do believe that with each one of you, you bring a set of tools and skills and expertise exactly to of course, even to as best meet the aims and objectives of the Muslim Family Law Hub. You've sort of alluded to what's ultimately the aims and objectives of the Muslim Family Law Hub, and why there is a need and why you felt a need. But very interestingly, all of you as directors bring a very different set of skills, and a skill set to the hub.
I think that's very important, because I think the way of the future is to have an interdisciplinary approach to problems. And if you're only sitting with lawyers, it becomes an echo chamber, because you're kind of only hearing, you're repeating the same kind of ideas. Whereas we brought on board, I approached various people. Yasmina Frankie, she's the CEO of Sanzaf. Now she comes with a wealth of knowledge in the area of especially zakah. And I find that when women reach a point, for instance, of divorce, there are three areas she needs help in. She needs legal advice. She needs inevitably financial empowerment, because she hasn't secured herself financially enough during her marriage. And she needs mental and psychological assistance to navigate the trauma of divorce. So those are the three areas. And so I brought Yasmina on board because of her involvement with Sanzaf, and they're doing excellent work, and especially they assist women going through divorce in various ways. And she's just been like an amazing kind of contributor to kind of ideas especially beyond law, very, very useful insights. And then Khadija Basir. She is the Chief Operating Officer at 91, which is the investment arm of Investec. And she particularly feels very strongly about empowerment of women as well. But she was running these workshops last year called Financially Fearless, which was really impressive. It was initially targeted at Muslim women only, but she opened it to women generally. And it was about empowering yourself financially as a woman, which I think we tend to neglect as women. We tend to put everybody else's needs first. So when we're earning, we make sure that we see to the family's needs, the groceries, to the children's school fees, to the baking sale that's happening at school. And then we tend to neglect putting away enough for our rainy day, as in ourselves only, and investing for ourselves. And so she feels quite strongly about that. And I thought she was a very useful person to kind of deal with the financial empowerment aspect of what we were looking at. And then there's Huda Abrams-Faker. She was the lead attorney at the Women's Legal Center for many years in the various Muslim family law cases that were brought by the Women's Legal Center. And currently she's the National Advocacy Manager at Black Sash, which also deals with social welfare grants. So she has a rich history in human rights and social welfare kind of legal work. And so I thought that the three of them were very dynamic women, and I was proven right because they've been a huge help in the months leading up to our registration. We then had Bowman's Gilfin Fatima Laha. She's the head of pro bono at Bowman's, and she facilitated the registration of our non-profit company. We're a non-profit company, and we're currently applying for Section 18A status. And we were formally registered in just before Ramadan, alhamdulillah. And then, of course, we had to go through the process of setting up the website. And this, at the moment, the website, so the Muslim Family Law Hub is a platform which will have different resources. It's an educational platform. And I think I need to make this very clear at this stage, is that we are non-profit, so we don't have the resources or the capacity to give individual advice to people yet. And that's what I think maybe there seems to be some misunderstanding based on some of the emails we've been getting from people giving us their situation, asking us what. We're not registered as a legal aid clinic, so we're not allowed to give legal advice yet. Maybe, inshallah, as Khadija said at the launch, this is day 1, maybe day 5, when we have big funders, we can employ lawyers to take on these kind of cases. But for now, it's about education, educating the community about what are our rights and responsibilities, both in Islamic law and South African law. So we are a 2% minority in this country, right? And we are bound by the country's laws. No matter what others might say, we are bound to uphold the laws of this country, like we do with our taxes, like we do when we stop at the robot. Those are all South African laws that you're upholding. But you're also entitled, the Constitution recognizes there are different cultural and religious family laws, and so you are entitled to practice your Muslim family laws, right? But the question is, how do you navigate both systems? And so one of our resources on our platform is the website. And the website is there to provide knowledge in an accessible way on marriage, divorce, and inheritance. And when we sat with the web designers, we had to provide them with the material. And then I gave these long published papers and thesis chapters to her. And she said, Fatima, nobody's going to read that. You need to break it down into an accessible bite-sized format so that the lay public can understand it. And that's when we then develop personas for each door. For the Babel Nikah, which is a marriage door. We then decided, okay, who's our persona who's going to ask? And we decided we're going to do it in the form of Q&As, right? So who's the person asking us the questions under the Babel Nikah? So we said, well, it's a 25-year-old woman. She's finished studied, or she's maybe entered the workplace. She's about to get married. She wants to know what are the kind of precautions she should take, what are rights under South African law, what are rights under Islamic law. Similarly, under the divorce door, we thought, who's the persona under the divorce door? She's a 35-year-old woman. She's now got 2 minor children. She's at the point where she doesn't want to be married to this man anymore. How can she get out of the marriage, both from an Islamic law perspective, and does she have any rights in terms of South African law to claim anything for herself or her children? Under the door of inheritance or Babel Mirath, we said, who's the persona there? And then we said, it's a 55-year-old man. He's now facing his mortality, this idea that life is not going to go on forever. He wants to make provision for his wife and his children. He wants to make sure it's consistent with Islamic law, but that also that it will be valid under South African law. What does he need to know in terms of Islamic law and South African law? So that's how we then conceived of the idea to have these 3 doors, and then we had a Q&A under the Islamic law section, under the South African law section, and then of course the process obviously evolved, and the board members said, but maybe we should have a checklist, right? So that people, in addition to the questions and answers, so that before you get married, you have a checklist. What should I cover? For Islamic law, I must make sure I discuss with my fiancé the mahar, maybe discuss things around work. Is he going to allow me to work during the marriage? Can I study, etc.? And should I have a Muslim marriage contract? And then, of course, under South African law, what are the different marital regimes? We can either get married by the Home Affairs and its in-community, or should we have an ANC? So those kind of questions that ticking those kind of boxes. And then the last tab under each door is a resource tab. And this we're still in the process of populating. But the idea there is that if you decide under the marriage door, you want to do an anti-nuptial contract, who do you go to for that? So then we will potentially provide the details of family law attorneys who will help you draft an anti-nuptial contract. Similarly, under divorce. So this is very interesting because inevitably women will come to me at the point of divorce, and they want to know where do we go? Where do we start? We hear this, we hear that. So for your Islamic divorce, we'll, for instance, say, these are the bodies that you can go to that will facilitate a talaq or will help you with getting a fasakh. These are the places, if you are in a situation where your experiencing domestic violence, here's, for instance, the domestic violence form that you can fill out and take it to your nearest police station. Then also, who are the lawyers that I can go to help me maybe navigate the South African law landscape. And then we're hopefully going to provide the details of lawyers for that too. So that's it's Islamic law, South African law, a checklist, and a resource tab under each door. Essentially a one-stop shop where you basically you can go onto this website and find all the information you need for each of the particular journeys you're undertaking: marriage, divorce, or inheritance.
I think what's so interesting there's many points I would like to raise, and I'm just going to put a few comments out there, then you pick up on any one of those. It's very interesting because one thing's about this at this intersection, the state law and Islamic law. So of course, as Muslims, yes, we are a very small minority, but the religious identity is a very strong one, and we are very present. We are very. That's why for many, and even when it comes to researchers, and so it almost comes as a bit of a surprise to realize that we're such a small minority, because and of course for many of us also we wear our religious hat, and we want to foreground that. So yes, when it comes to matters, as you say, these are very, very significant life moments. You know, the idea of when one gets married, or any other circumstances you're speaking about, like for example inheritance, where it's not just necessarily the spouse that's affected, but also families. But what I wanted to also say around that is that yes, state law trumps everything else. But the reality is that when it comes to Islamic law, of course, we want to do the right thing. Also, there, it's incredibly helpful that somebody like yourself, as an expert in South African law, but you also did, as you said, this particular degree, and telling us how enriching it was, and yes, reminding us how rich Islamic law is, and that difference is part of the discourse.
Yes.
Yet it's often presented to us as, you say, immutable. And we realize the reality is that for many of our women, when we speak about lived experiences, once they do get divorced, or once there's issues around inheritance, then one realizes how they are often up against brick walls, because the very essence of your religiosity is questioned, through some of these concepts like sabr, for example, like why are you even here? What kind of a wife are you, or what kind of a mother? And even though not all of these things are said outright, it's there.
Absolutely.
It is there, and those types of things, it transcends class. So one can be a professional, or one can be, somebody who maybe finds herself in a financial predicament. But it's your spirituality in many ways that is under the spotlight. And so yes, we find that Islamic law is often idealized. This idea that women have all these rights, and and Islam came to liberate women. But in real life, in terms of lived experiences, what does it mean?
Yes.
And so for me, that really sort of resonates with me when you said right at the start, like when it comes to application, what does it mean?
Yes.
No, state law. And so oftentimes, yes, again, women are questioned around that, their religiosity. Why do you run to the courts?
Yes.
Why do you run to the courts when Islam offers you these, these liberatory laws, and we are empowered, but it's only there in theory.
Yes.
And so essentially we find all these male voices speaking on behalf of women, and deciding for women what they ought to feel. And I want to be clear, Fatima, that this is never a playoff between men and women. It's about complementarity.
Yes, absolutely.
So women find themselves in this position where, yes, there's state law, there's Islamic law, but you also feel like you are up against male voices who decide for you, because the reality is that our organizations, our Muslim organizations, are largely populated and run by males.
Yeah, I think that's really important, is that what I've realized over the years is there are limits to what law can do. That we need to be able to change the narrative, and that the law has, and of course we're going to use the law as a tool, right? But the community themselves have to change that narrative about where women are reluctant to assert or to exercise agency, precisely because they met with this like you say, wall of resistance,
Yeah.
and people questioning their religiosity and their intentions as, oh, a good Muslim woman wouldn't do that, which I find quite problematic. So, for instance, and you're absolutely right, it transcends class and educational kind of backgrounds. So if I have a couple sitting in front of me, and I would advise the woman, for instance, that in Islam, you can include in your marriage contract that your husband delegates his right of talaq to you.
Yes.
It's called talaq tafweed, and it's accepted, a classical kind of doctrine, talaq tafweed, at the start of the contract, like she negotiates her mahr, she can say, her father can say, or she can say, and I want my future husband to delegate his right of divorce, talaq, to me. But I've had many instances where I've had educated women sitting, and the guy, the future husband's looking not very comfortable with this idea, and she says, it's fine, I'm not going to insist on that. Which I find really interesting.
It seems as if I'm greedy or self-centered or selfish.
That's right. Or even asking. So let's say in Islamic law, the default position is generally out of community. So what's yours is yours, what's hers is hers. But you can reach a marriage. Islamic marriage is not just a sacred bond, it's a contract.
Yes.
And you can agree
transactional
on anything that is not contrary to the Sharia. So in fact, you can say, well, actually, yes, that might be the default position, but we've decided, for instance, that whatever house we buy, our first home together is going to be in both our names, or it's only going to be in my name. But what is really important is that we work on changing people's mindsets. So the law is one thing, and a lot of the time people don't even know about the fact, let's say, talaq tafweed, or they don't know that they can, aside from talaq and fasakh, there's also khula, which is also an acceptable form of divorce. So it's educating people. That's the first step. But then also people trying to really work really hard at changing that narrative. And you're saying about this is a very common issue as well, that many of these bodies within the community, you're absolutely right, are male dominated. And I've written an article which is now currently under review, where I raise this. Why is that? Where are the women?
Because we have women. We have women in our community.
We undoubtedly have women. Because if you look at it, look at all the female graduates that come out of IPSA, out of Medina Institute, out of Basira Institute. We have all these amazing institutes run by women, for women. And these women are being educated. In fact, this Sheikha Mamuna, who passed away recently, she was one of the unsung heroines, one of the first female graduates from Al-Azhar. How is it that she never was given a position on any of these bodies? She was a qualified scholar.
Yes.
Right? And there are others like her. Why are women not being given a seat at the table? That is the question that we as women should also be asking, advocating for, and agitating for.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, the reality is when you go before a council, you feel more at ease and more represented if that panel is representative.
Yes.
Isn't it?
Yes, of course.
You're going to feel more comfortable if you see, because that's the nature of representation. And the reality is in South Africa, we are required to kind of uphold those principles of equality, diversity.
But again, theoretically. It's there theoretically, and it's so important when you speak about this that we keep in mind that yes, there's the letter of the law and there's the spirit of the law.
Yes, that's
and so
also
we need
very important.
So we need to constantly remember that, and yes, understand how intimidating it is for somebody to enter into that space and to sit there and already feel like my world is falling apart, and now I need to come here for
justify
exactly
why, and get judged in the process.
Exactly.
And I've spoken to women who've sat in those and they feel so overwhelmed, so intimidated. And there's ways you can overcome that.
Yeah.
It's not.
And we also want to emphasize, Fatima, and because oftentimes people do think that, yes, this is now a playoff between genders and we want to. No. a family is, and so I want to remind ourselves of this, that the family is the cornerstone of society. It's a microcosm of society.
Absolutely.
If you look at the Muslim family law hub, this is what it's about, because a healthy family, the knock-on effect and the benefits thereof into society. And so this is what is happening. And so when you speak about, and we have about 2-3 minutes left, and I just want you to perhaps give your concluding comments. We're going to continue with these conversations. It's such important conversations to be had. But when you mention, for example, that it starts there, the discussions pre-marriage, where women already feel as if, so mahar, for example, and what the purpose of mahar is, and we find people are judging us already at that point.
Yes.
Wat's wat die vroue sê? Sy vra
so
so
baie.
baie. Ja, is dit nou nodig om dus, but you are the one, as you say, as a professional yourself, that see women coming to you
right.
for advice. So perhaps just in our last 2-3 minutes, just your closing comments around the need, yes, and the objectives, yes, and maybe just your comments on the Muslim Family Law Hub.
So I think what you make is a very important point. It's not about, we were very clear about the fact that it wasn't the Muslim Women's Law Hub. We wanted to make it the Muslim Family Law Hub, because you're right, the family is the building block of our community. And if families are falling apart, then there's no wonder that the state of our community and the ummah. We need to be building stronger families, and that's not only about educating women, it's educating women and men about their rights and responsibilities. Because there's no point in, you know, and that is what the hub is about. It's about educating our communities about both Islamic law and South African law, so that people can uphold whatever the responsibilities are, both men and women, so that we can have stronger families, and with that strengthening and enriching our communities, because that is really important. And of course, the reality is that inevitably women are the ones who are left more vulnerable on death and divorce of their spouses. And that's maybe why when women negotiate these kind of agreements at the start of the marriage, they obviously feel very worried about what the community thinks of them.
Yes.
But it's something that one has to really try to move beyond. Of course, one has to be reasonable in expectations, and that's why we don't have a culture of asking for a deferred dowry. So let's say you're getting married and the husband can't afford it now, no problem, but then you sit. This is what I want upfront, and this is the deferred, which is not necessarily a custom in Cape Town, but it's something that women should consider. And I think that we need to move away from this, exactly like you're saying, you know, labeling people and judging people, and working towards strengthening families, which is ultimately going to be the objective of the hub. And for now, we have the website, but inshallah, we really hope that we can have more grassroots workshops within the community, and workshopping all these issues that we have on, because some people read, some people listen to podcasts, which we're also working on, where some people prefer the physical interaction. So hopefully, inshallah, we'll be able to do
and
that.
many more conversations
Inshallah,
between
Khadija.
ourselves
Thank you so much.
and the Muslim Family Law Hub. There's so many WhatsApps that we got. I'm just going to read this one that says from our listener, the little girl in me is doing cartwheels, Khadija. Definitely what our community desperately needs, and the fact that it's female-led. Alhamdulillah. Shukran so much for joining us in studio today. I'm really looking forward to many more conversations. Clearly, there is a need for this. And again, congratulations to the team.
Thank you, Khadija. Thank you. From all of them.
Assalamu alaikum, Fatima.
Shukran.